Hey, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to pick up with Unit 13 and lesson number 4, the evolution of civil rights. Now, every one of us, of course, is very familiar, of course, with the civil rights movement. We talked a little bit about it, of course, prior to getting in this particular lesson. We're going to find that the civil rights movement, of course, is going to become an example for other disenfranchised or underrepresented groups. And we're going to find there's going to be a little bit of an evolution or a re-emergence of civil rights in a different form. What we're going to do is look at our unit focus question. This is: what effect did the Nixon presidency have on the American public psyche? Why did conservatism become such an attractive political philosophy in the United States? And describe the effect of technology and scientific innovation on the increased globalization of the United States. We will look at our vocabulary. In this particular case, what we want you to do is what we always ask you to do, is write these terms down in your journal, of course, and define them yourselves. And as they come up in the lesson, we'll try to address as many of them as we can. Next, we have a few lesson focus questions. We have 3, which we will address at the end of the lesson. Number 1, why did busing and affirmative action receive so much backlash, even though they were both created to give minorities more access to educational and economic opportunity? And number 2, identify economic opportunities Native people gained as a result of the American Indian movement. And 3, what provided legal protections for disabled Americans in the 1990s. So we're going to be talking about a civil rights movement that addresses each one of these things. Journal topic: what we want you to do is take out your journals and write down this particular statement. Identify minority groups in America that viewed the African American civil rights movement and took up the same banner to win civil rights for themselves. So what we want you to do is write that down, write your thoughts down, and we'll talk about it in a few moments. Well, when you think about the American Civil Rights Movement, of course, that begins in the 50s and goes throughout the 60s, it's going to be seen as an example for Native Americans, for disabled Americans. We're going an example, of course, for women with the Women Liberation Movement. Latinos. So when you look at these different groups, what they're going to do is look at the example that was set by African Americans, of course, in the civil rights movement, the use of nonviolent techniques like civil disobedience, sit-ins, teach-ins, different things, of course, that they'll utilize to bring recognition, and enlightenment, of course, to their own causes. So when you look at that general topic, some of those minority groups, once again, anybody that was underrepresented in the country that felt like that they could better their situation by bringing notoriety to it, they use the African American Civil Rights Movement as an example. Busing and affirmative action. The outlawing of discrimination and segregation made little impact on the improvement of African American opportunities in education and employment. One of the answers to that in the minds of many people at that time was busing and affirmative action. Since African American schools, of course, were in communities that didn't have access to great resources, and in some cases because they were still ultimately segregated because of where people lived. It wasn't segregation necessarily based on law, but segregation based on circumstance. They call it de facto segregation. And in an effort to end that, busing, of course, was created. Affirmative action was created to remedy some of the issues that were happening, of course, in the workplace, to make sure that minorities had opportunity for access, and establishes in some people's mind a quota system that a lot of people, of course, will call reverse racism. Busing would get minority students from their neighborhood schools and send them to schools in white communities. It was declared illegal by the court case Milliken v. Bradley. Affirmative action would mandate any business or school supported by government funds doing business with the federal government to recruit minorities. Regents of the University of California versus Bakke stated that affirmative action caused reverse discrimination by creating quotas for minorities. So both busing and affirmative action will have their challenges and will be challenged in the Supreme Court, and both of them ultimately, of course, will be declared to be discriminatory themselves. In 1961, Native American groups created the Declaration of Indian Purpose, which demanded federal programs to expand economic opportunities for Native people. It was one of the first attempts to fight for Native rights. And once again, the Native Americans saw the African American Civil Rights Movement and believed that they could use these techniques to gain opportunities for themselves. In 1968, the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed, which guaranteed Native people the protection of the Bill of Rights and recognized the authority of the tribal courts. In essence, it basically made them citizens of the United States of America. The American Indian movement started in 1969 when some Native people decided that federal government's actions to help Native people fell short. Occupation by members of at Alcatraz and Wounded Knee happened because Natives wanted the government to honor treaties it had signed. And by the mid-1970s, some gains were made by Natives, like the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act, the American Indian Religious Freedom and Restoration Acts, and the sovereignty to create resorts, casinos, oil and gas businesses on Native land. In other words, this here. The Bill of Rights, in essence, gives them citizenship, or the protections of citizenship, but they are able to maintain their own autonomy or sovereignty on the reservations themselves, which affords them the opportunity to have control of their natural gas and oil rights, also affords them the opportunity, of course, to create resorts and casinos, things that could benefit Native tribes. Americans with disabilities, just as Native Americans saw the African-American Civil Rights Movement as an example, the way to get specific rights for themselves. Disabled people in America saw the same opportunities. The movement to improve access for people with disabilities started at the University of California in Berkeley in 1970, so it shouldn't be a surprise. Berkeley is going to be the hotbed for a lot of activity and activism. The movement encouraged independent living for people with disabilities. The disability movement sought to end discrimination and remove barriers for independent living for disabled persons. The Architectural Barriers Act of 1968, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 were legislative actions to improve access for the disabled in America. Access in terms of schools, access in terms of things that you and I may take for granted, just like access, of course, to buildings, or ramps, of course, will have to be built. Or if it's a two-story building, elevators, of course, have to be placed in. So when you look at it, it has a tremendous impact on the way that things in the country, of course, have to change to meet some of those needs that disabled, of course, Americans have. Here you have President George H.W. Bush, and he's signing the Americans with Disabilities Act. He's in the middle here, of course, and he's joined with some disabled, of course, in the signing of this bill, and it changes the way we see disabled people, of course, in the country. All right, we had 3 lesson focus questions that we're going to address. The first one, why did busing and affirmative action receive so much backlash, even though they were both created to give minorities more access to the educational and economic opportunity? 2, identify economic opportunities Native people gained as a result of the American Indian movement. And 3, what provided legal protections for disabled Americans in the 1990s? Well, how did busing and affirmative action receive much backlash? Because they were both viewed by many Americans as being reverse discriminatory. Many Americans thought that government interference in individual opportunities was a bad idea, and racial consideration shouldn't take precedent over merit. Same argument that you can hear throughout our history from this particular time period. Second question, identify economic opportunities Native people gained as a result of the American Indian movement. The biggest thing was sovereignty, to determine what happens on their reservations and things that happen there to benefit them. But Native people gained economic opportunity through land reclamation, tribal control over their resources, greater access to federal funding, improved recognition of Native rights, and autonomy to create resorts and casinos on Native land that would benefit Native people. And then the last and final lesson focus question was, what provided legal protections for disabled Americans in the 1990s? Prohibition of discrimination in employment, public services, transportation, and accommodations, legal mandate to ensure access to facilities to secure disabled integration in society and the workplace. In other words, there would be no restrictions that they would have to face that would deny them access, of course, to the same thing that able-bodied people, of course, would have access to. All right, that ends lesson number 4. And as we can see, the civil rights impact, of course, is having even more impact with Native group, of course, and then the disabled. And we've already talked about it, of course, a little bit, of course, with women and Latinos. So when you look at the civil rights movement, it becomes an example of what people can do when they organize and they use nonviolent techniques and have a unified message. But once again, that's just one man's opinion. Don't take my word for it. What you can do, of course, is do your own research, draw your own conclusion. And with that, I'll see you next time.